Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Poison Pen. I'm Barbara Peters, and I'm delighted to be hosting Stuart Turton today. We thought, for purposes of clarity, since what we really have here is a locked room mystery translated to a locked ship mystery, in part, that we would show you what the ship would have looked like. This is a photo from the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, of what is usually referred to as wooden castles because of their enormous height. And unfortunately, in the case of the Vasa, too narrow width with not enough ballast. So the Vasa set sail out of Stockholm harbor, rolled right over, sank to the bottom, drowning everybody on board, and it was brought up relatively recently and turned into a museum. So this is what the ship that Stuart has set his book in would have looked like. And the next picture is?
The next picture is.
As we change. Right.
The next picture is going to be. Right. There.
All right.
Ooh.
Isn't that great? So this is a photo of the ship, the Vasa, but a similar ship to the Sardam under sail. Isn't that a great photo, Stuart?
That is brilliant. I want one of those for my study. That would be intense as you walk in. That would get me inspired every day.
And then third, we're going to show you a look at the interior of the ship, just so you get some idea of what it would have been like for those who were sailing on the Sardam. Yay.
Ooh.
And if you just hit stop share, it will go back to.
Now you do it.
I do it. All right, so there's the cavernous interior. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay.
Wonderful. And now we have Stuart. Alrighty. Say, I am always terrified, Stuart, that if I hit anything on this screen, that everything will go away and I will blow you into a million digital bits. So Patrick saves me. In any case, I do think that visuals help when we're doing a story that is unusual in its setting. And we should say at the outset that The Devil in the Dark Water is based on a true event, an actual shipwreck, right?
Yeah, the wreck of the Batavia. So a ship very much like the one you just showed, like would have been almost identical actually, because they were built to spec. They were like the way modern homes are built. So they just rolled through the shipyards and came out one after another almost identically. But I came across that was wrecked off the coast of Australia in 1629. And I was backpacking around Australia at the time, and I came across this story, and it's haunting. Like the one you just told about the Vasa is just a horrible story, but the passengers and crew of the Batavia would have welcomed that. Like they would have welcomed just being rolled over and drowned immediately because of the horrors they went through. Those poor guys, they were shipwrecked off the coast of Australia. 200 people managed to get off the boat. They must have thought, aren't we the luckiest people in the world, that 200 of us would be the captain sets off sail to get some help 30 days away from Jakarta using, celestial navigation, just his own seamanship to get, because they're in uncharted waters. Unbeknownst to the captain, he leaves the rest of the passengers in the care of a psychopath, probably one of the world's first documented psychopaths. By the time the captain returned with help 30 days later, 125 people had been murdered by him and his conspirators, leaving a handful of survivors. So it's awful. It's a brutal story, Barbara. It's really, I read that story when I was 23, and I wrote this book when I was 40. That's how long it's stuck in my head like a splinter.
It is a terrible story. We should also mention the reason there was so much traffic, because this was a perilous sea lane, was because the Dutch East India Company was sending ships, merchants, and that's another interesting thing too, is the role of the merchants in running the ship in the expedition. We can get to that. But they were reaching the Spice Islands, known to us as Indonesia, and known to them as Batavia, which is today Jakarta. And I had a wonderful conversation with Andrew Taylor, whom you may or may not yet have met, a British author. We'll get to. But we were both remarking how the spice trade was supposed to be, and was in fact, so incredibly rich that it persuaded the Dutch to give up New York for the the East Indies or the Spice Islands. And how did that turn out? But at the time, it looked as though the Dutch had done a fairly shrewd thing. But we also went on to talk about the fact that, what developed into empires were actually initially merchants looking to find sources of supply chain and a market. And these were really early venture capitalists, weren't they? They were stock sharers. And that's why the ship, the actual ship you mentioned too, that's why the merchant was left in charge. Not, there was no naval officer on the ship.
No, I wouldn't have had any seafaring expertise whatsoever. He just would have been, the captain would have been responsible for getting the ship across the ocean to the destination. But at any point, and then the real life story, that was a guy called Peltzat. But the captain, Adrian Jacobs, in the real life story, he was a bus driver, effectively. He was a bus driver, and somebody could tell him at any point to stop, turn around, go to a different place, do anything without any knowledge of how to get there or how it would be done, which I think contributed to the actual true life inspiration for the story, because those two men on that ship did not get along. They hated each other. So in my book, I've got two similar roles, and those two men hate each other as well, and that's directly taken from that relationship. Because you imagine being that skilled, being that good at what you do, because this was the flagship, the Batavia, the real life story this was based on. It was the flagship of the East India Company. It was given to this captain because he'd been serving them for 20 years. He was a brilliant seaman. He was a fantastic officer. And then in the course of one voyage, he ended up mutinying and sort of like making these terrible decisions because he hated this guy over him so very much. It's incredible.
Well, it is. And so I think it's important to know that for a reader who starts reading your book, and it's really the governor, the political officer in Batavia, who is getting on board the ship, and bad things happen. He's not a nice character. There's lots of things about him to truly dislike, right?
Well, he's the one who's most closely based on a real historical person. So the Governor General at that time was called, he was not Jan Han, sorry, his name was something Jan, and he was terrible. He basically did everything that I accuse my fictional character of doing in real life. So there's an incident that comes up quite prominently where he some of the people he traded with in Indonesia, they reneged on a contract, so he had the entire population of the island butchered, all of them, and then replaced them with slaves to bring the crop in as a warning to anybody else who may think about reneging on a contract with the company. And that was seen as a perfectly valid tactic. And he did that without, from historical record, without compunction. He generally thought for the survival of the company, that had to happen. That had to be, you had to stamp that down immediately, no negotiation. No, why would they? So they've reneged on the contract because A, they'd worked out that it wasn't, in their best interest. B, it would probably starve them, and C, it was backbreaking labour for pittance. But there was no attempt to go in and sort of talk to the people about that. They were just wiped out. So he is evil incarnate in the story, but he was actually relatively evil incarnate in real life. Whereas a lot of the other characters are about 50-50, they're 50% fictionalised and 50% historical. He is basically 90% historical.
Well, I mean, it is so interesting to me that, what you wound up with is people who were merchants taking over and governing territory without really any formal sense of empire. If you read about the British East India Company, it took a mutiny in 1857 to overthrow the power of the British East India Company and turn it into empire, make Victoria the Empress. I just find it amazing that that all that went on, and it seemed perfectly normal. But it does give you a wonderful cast of characters to put aboard your ship. This book has been described by various people in various ways. Do you think Pirates of the Caribbean meets Sherlock Holmes? I'm trying to spare you doing your pitch because I know that you've done it so often. I thought maybe we could forego your doing the pitch and we'd sort of talk around it. But do you think Pirates of the Caribbean meets Sherlock Holmes is fair, or is that just catchy from a marketing standpoint?
Oh, I'd take both. As you said, I hate doing the pitches for books, and you have to do it. You have to get it down for the first one because you've got to take it to an agent, take it to a publisher, and it's basically your entire life is in 2 lines for the first 6 months of the book. The second one, no one asks you to do it. You've got a contract at that point. Like, you're okay. You just go into the world. So I'd never thought about how to describe it until somebody said in an interview, like, so what's this book about? And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, it's Sherlock Holmes in a boat, basically. So Pirates of the Caribbean meets Sherlock Holmes is fantastic. I am perfectly happy with that. And it is, you know, as you say, it's marketing and catchy, and that all works out well. Because, like, you can't ever, there's no book in the world that you can do justice to in 2 lines. There's nothing. But you've got to try and hook people immediately, right? So you end up saying things like this, and you get increasingly desperate. And it's just like, oh, like everybody who ever came across my first book, The 7.5 Deaths, I've never heard the same description of that twice. Everybody just has their own description of that. So now I just, whatever you think it is what it is.
I think that's a very relaxing way for you to look at it, and certainly in a book as complicated as both of your books, in fact, are, it's good to have a range of attempts to describe it in order to hit different audiences. So when I was speaking to Andrew Taylor in 1982 wrote a book called Caroline Minuscule, which won the John Creasy Dagger for Best First Mystery. And in talking to him yesterday, he said that it was at the upper edge of the golden age of mystery, and many British mysteries at that point were quite formulaic and often called cozy, which is a different term in Brit speak than American speak, but nonetheless. And so he wanted to do something different, and he decided that the way forward was to have a central character who was not a hero, in fact it was a murderer from the get-go, and then combine that with a typical British English crime novel. And it struck me that Andrew is kind of your ancestor here, in that the 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, you thought you'd kind of stick a tag at the Christie. And in this book, it's perfectly clear that you are not a big fan of Sherlock Holmes himself, but you really like the sidekicks. So you come down really on the Watson side of Sherlock. Now, am I right in assuming that, or am I off base?
Not completely correct. I think Sherlock Holmes is a tool. I really, really dislike Sherlock Holmes a very great deal. But it was strange because when I wrote 7.5 Deaths are in the US, I love Agatha Christie. Like, I unreservedly, all her bad ones, because she has plenty of bad books. I love all those as well, and I love the swings she takes. She plays with structure. She plays with character. She's more ambitious, I think, than a lot of people give her credit for. Conan Doyle, I like the adventures. I like that Sherlock Holmes dashes around places and waves pistols and put disguises on. You can't ever imagine a Poirot or Marple doing that. They're just like, it's the ridiculous stories. Like, snakes kill people in Conan Doyle stories. They're insane. I like that element. Sherlock Holmes as a central character is the worst. He's absolutely just the worst all the time. He's irredeemable. He only ever takes mysteries to satisfy his own intellectual curiosity. He's never doing it to help anybody. He doesn't really care about the outcomes of the mysteries most of the time. Watson is a war doctor. He's a hero at his side all the time, who's treated like an absolute imbecile and just belittled all the time, to the point where by the end of the Sherlock Holmes stories, you generally see Watson begin to believe that he is an imbecile, when he clearly isn't. He gets married multiple times. He starts his own very successful practice in Harley Street, all in the margins of these stories. You've got Inspector Lestrade, who is like the foremost, at that point, is the head of the foremost policing unit in the entire world. Again, couldn't find a cat up a tree. Very, very strange to me. So even when I was reading those stories as a boy, I had loads of problems with them, while also really weirdly enjoying them. So I think it's very strange. I think this book was like my psychiatrist. It was my way of sort of dealing with my Holmes issues. As I was writing them down, I got to belittle my Sherlock Holmes style character. I got to push him out of the limelight and raise the sidekicks up and finally give them their due, as I thought they deserved it, including like the characters who, almost like in a Sherlock Holmes story, you get all these peripheral characters. You get all this cast of people who come in to give like one piece of evidence. And again, like, I drag them into the limelight, and in some cases make them part of the mystery and make them part of the investigation, which I love doing.
Yes, you do. I will share one story with you, which, there are many Holmes fanatics, the Baker Street Irregular. If you own a mystery bookstore, which we are in part, you were familiar with Sherlockians and the total dedication to the canon. But back in the 90s, I taught crime fiction at Arizona State University. And one of the selections that I started them out with was The Mystery of the Speckled Band. And, rereading it, I suddenly realized that the entire thing revolves around the fact that the bed is fixed to the floor. And so, one of the kids spoke up to me in class and they said, why didn't they just move the bed? And, and I thought that is so true, that story, the snake coming down, really depends upon that. Whereas, an intelligent person would have thought, as people are dying in the room, that maybe they should relocate the furniture.
Or from the room.
Yeah.
I'm just like, this feels like a dangerous room to me. I'm not happy with its history. I think I'll just go and sleep in the living room. Is that okay with everybody? Cool. Yeah. There's a lot of, it's very strange. I love interacting with Sherlock Holmes fans because I think this isn't always fair, but a lot of Sherlock Holmes fans I've met are actually Sherlock Holmes fans of the recent adaptations or the sort of like the more recent stuff, and that stuff subtly always tries to make Holmes more of an actual character. It always tries to sort of give him an emotional arc. It always like brings him closer. And when those people tend to go back to the original Conan Doyle stories, it is the very strange things. They are like, some of those stories are so beautifully outlandish that you just get to the end and you're like, nope, that didn't land for me at all. I don't know what that was about. That's very strange. Well, so I was reading one recently, the Mystery of the Dancing Men, which is where it opens with like somebody, he got this very sinister telegram, and it's just a load of dancing men, like a pictograph of dancing men. And he thinks this is unusual enough to bring it to Sherlock Holmes, and it's not. He just got a thing through the post of some dancing men. It's a really strange story, but there are always these. I'm massively annoying all Sherlock Holmes fans here. I can feel them through the webcam just hating me. I'm going to get hate mail, but it's nice. What writing this book did make me realise is writing the deductive method that Sherlock Holmes has and trying to replicate that. It's actually incredibly difficult to do in a way that feels convincing. Because even if you get it a little bit wrong and miss one of the links in the chain, it falls apart immediately in a way that Poirot's style of deduction doesn't. It's interesting.
I think you're right. I think to call them the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes makes a lot of sense because in many ways, they're not any different than Scaramouche or, some of the. I love books like that. I've always liked Swashbucklers, the Errol Flynn School, which are fun. But in your book now, in The Devil in the Dark Water, which in theory we are speaking about, although we're ranging down, who is the Sherlock Holmes and who is the Watson?
So I've got a guy called Samuel Pepys. He is my Sherlock Holmes style investigator, and he's very Byron-esque. He's very sort of like frail and small and beautiful. And then he's protected. His Watson is a guy called Aaron Hayes, who is huge, even by the standards of the day I'm talking. He's a massive, massive individual. And he's scarred, and he's been at war his entire life, and he's basically torn apart. And he doesn't want to be at war anymore. He has no interest in that. And he's found ability in protecting Samuel Pepys. Like, this is the job he loves doing. But when Samuel Pepys is, because at the beginning of the book, Samuel Pepys is in chains. He's been accused of a crime. Nobody knows what he's accused of. Nobody knows whether he's guilty or not, let alone him. And Aaron sets himself these dual things. One, he's got to get his friend out of these chains because he's been sailed back to Amsterdam to be executed, and that's something his bodyguard cannot allow to happen under any circumstances. But before he can do that, he's got to solve the mystery of what's threatening the ship, because obviously if the ship sinks because they think there's a demon board trying to sink the ship, then he loses his friend anyway. So he's caught betwixt and between. And he does not, this is not one of those stories where we have a sidekick who believes they're better than the protagonist. It's not this Watson, Aaron Hayes, doesn't want this job. He has no interest in it. He doesn't want to be the protagonist of his own story. He's perfectly happy being in the back. So he just wants to protect his master, he wants to keep him safe, and he wants to be ignored as best he can. So it's really interesting to write a character who's forced into the limelight and who genuinely is uncomfortable there and doesn't want to be there. And that brings in, we have Sarah Vessel, who is a noblewoman of the secret, and she kind of ends up being the Holmes of this piece in a really, I don't know if you'd agree, but to me as I was writing it, that's what it felt like. She kept forcing her way out of the page, and she was the one who ultimately became sort of the driving force in this mystery.
She's wonderful, and you snuck in a bit of your pitch there.
I know, sorry about that.
It's okay. I was sparing you. So we should probably say that, because we've talked about the evil governor based upon a real life person, and we've talked about Sarah, and we've talked about Samuel Pepys and Aaron. what happens is they're all boarding this ship called the Sardam in Batavia, right?
Mhm.
Jakarta.
Yep.
And they're setting sail back to Amsterdam. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's the reverse of the voyage that inspired your original thing. So we're all on the ship, and one of the things I love about this, and you know, I go back to Christie, there are so many variations on the whole idea of a closed circle, you know, where and from a crime writer standpoint, you know, if the circle is completely porous, then it's going to be nearly impossible to investigate the crime because anyone could do it. So it's wonderful to create some kind of a physical boundary in which you've got your cast of characters, a murder occurs or whatever crime it is, and fortuitously your detective is somehow there, or detectives as the case may be. And so, you know, it could be a country house. I'm trying to think. Anne Cleves just wrote a really interesting country house modern murder with a blizzard, you know, which is a kind of a classic Christie thing to do.
Yeah.
But, you know, I've seen them done in theaters, I've seen them done in banquet rooms, and out the ship is really ideal. And that's what you got here. You have managed to put this whole cast, murderers, possible detectives, suspects, whatever, in a ship, and then put it out on the ocean. So clearly everything that happens has to be a function of the actions of those characters. And that's why I wanted to show a picture of the interior of the ship so that you could see, you know, what it, I mean, I assume that was probably the captain's quarters, because let's face it, the crew really had a miserable time in hammocks down in the bilges with rats and
I think everybody, I mean, there was even the captain's quarters wouldn't have been comfortable by modern standards. They were nothing about a ship like that was luxurious. They were built for the cargo first and the profit first, and then they were built for people second, and only grudgingly and only because the company needed people to sail the ship. But there's a statistic that basically 1 in 3 people who depart on those voyages would die, basically. So a third of everybody who ever set sail from Amsterdam to go into the East Indies would die. Or so they'd either die of a shipboard accident, they would die of disease, there was piracy, there were storms, there were all sorts of things, or they would actually eventually reach the East Indies and then they would die there because malaria was rampant, or they would just simply drink themselves to death once they got there, and there's something in the heat would get them. So it was a doomed voyage, and the reason I wanted to do a ship was, of course, that was the inspiration of the story. But it's a haunted house at sea, Barbara. Like, it's just perfect from the get-go. Like, that ship, it's claustrophobic. It brings all the tension you'd ever want just built into the concept of it, because they didn't have any modern navigation. They didn't really know where they were going. They pointed themselves in a straight line from the port they were leaving. And if after 2 days the island that they expected to be sailing past was on the right, they were going in the right direction. And if it wasn't, they were likely buggered. Like, this was just brilliant. Like, just as writing a mystery novel, that you want thriller elements, you want tension elements, you want a bit Pirates of the Caribbean, all those sorts of things. It comes built into the concept. I didn't have to put a great deal of work into it because that fear would have been ever present. Then you have the things where the ship would have been packed and crammed with people on every deck, every place. There would have been eyes and ears and everything, which makes plotting a murder on it and a mystery on it just fantastic, because that's something as a writer and as a plotter I have to defeat. I have to work out ways around that and clever ways to go around it while still maintaining the integrity of that ship and the period and how things would have operated. So just everything about this book from the start was just wonderful to me, because it was a great challenge to write it. And then once I started writing it, I got to be as crazy as I wanted, because it is like, it's a swashbuckler, it's a murder mystery swashbuckler. That's brilliant fun. I was Captain Blood in the entire thing. I was halfway through people having swords in their teeth and swinging off ship and ropes and things. I just never quite got there.
It is wonderful fun. I also think, you know, that in a ship you maintain a hierarchical structure of the people on board. You know, so I mean, you've got in the sailors, the captain, there's a certain command structure, and then you've got a societal structure, because I mean the governor's going to be like more equal than everybody else, and so it goes. And then you've got your detective Samuel. He's locked up. You know, so he's not ranging around the ship, but is dependent upon other people. His sort of Baker Street irregulars or sidekicks, as it were, to figure things out. But talk to me about the locked room mystery, because I've already said that you've created the Agatha Christie Country House at Sea. But more than that, a locked room mystery comes into play. Now, what is your perception of a locked room mystery?
Exactly that it should be basically impossible. That from first blush, I mean, for me, it is as simple as that nobody could possibly have done it. That is how I start it's how I did Seven Deaths, my first novel. It's how I did it with this one, and there's three of those. There's effectively three locked room mysteries, actually. It's built around these three mysteries. And they're all like slightly different. So an impossible theft, an impossible murder, and an impossible pursuit is the way I sort of phrase it. And the idea was always just to make it look like the only way this could be happening is supernaturally. That the most strangely the most rational explanation for these things is the most irrational, because again that tied into the period, it tied into the belief system. These people did believe in the occult. They were incredibly superstitious. They would genuinely and freely. There's a book referenced in the book called the Demonologica, again based on a real thing, a couple of real things actually, and it was the equivalent back then of the Bible, but it was about demons. It had exactly, and it was all about the hierarchies of hell, the demons, how they tempted human beings, how they were to be banished, how they were summoned, who they reported to in hell, and it was treated seriously. It was treated with reverence. It was a tool for fighting evil, and it was handed out and taught, and it was believed in. So things like that, I love the idea of creating a mystery novel, a historical mystery novel, that genuinely takes that concept seriously, that is genuinely like a suspect in this is a demon. That your first and primary suspect is the supernatural, because that is the only way this could have happened. And there was just something incredibly appealing about that, having the one person on the boat who's probably the most rational, being the person who's locked up and can't do anything about it, just being like, this doesn't sound right, but I can't do anything, and leaving it to everybody else while everybody runs around like headless chickens. It was, so yeah, I started always with the idea of, and it's for me as a writer, there's a sort of meta element to this. I begin every book I write, the two books I've written, the third book I'm writing now, I begin them in terror. So I begin them in absolute fear that I can't write them. The conceit is too wild or too hard, and I'm not going to get away with it. But if I don't have that, I don't sit down at my computer every day for 8 hours and write them, because I don't have that investment in them. So a locked room mystery for me is an absolutely impossible crime with a fairly rational ending, and usually one that looks, when you get there, you did have the clues in front of you. You can see it. You can see the order through it. Like, you can see the chains, and you feel like you've been treated fairly. Because I think if you get to the end of a locked room mystery and you don't feel like you've been treated fairly as the reader, it just falls apart. It's just confetti in your hands.
Well, it is supposed to be a challenge that you, the author, throw out to the reader, and the reader at the end of the challenge can say, I could have beat it, or, I missed it, or however it turns out. I mean, it's clear that you are a writer who doesn't write unless you are challenging yourself, even if you're scared. You're obviously not going to engage if you're not. But let me go back to something you said, because last night I did a wonderful book launch for Alice Hoffman, whose Practical Magic is now like a cult movie classic. And she begins this one, Magic Lessons in 17th century Northern England, with witches. And a conversation we had, and I also, again, had with Andrew, who you must meet Andrew, because he's kind of an ancestor of yours, was, why was the 17th century such a fertile ground for witches? What was it about that century when witches and demons and the supernatural made such an impact upon people? People believed in them so much, and that translated for Alice in her character coming across to Puritan New England and bringing that same with it. And so I think your book works. This book works in part, the demon and the supernatural, because it is, what, 1634? Is that where we are?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so you're in this 17th century. You've still got James on the throne, who was a believer in witches. You've got witch trials coming up. And maybe, Andrew suggested that it's a part attributed to Puritanism, that women were considered, for witches anyway, evil temptress, that whole Adam and Eve thing. There's a whole lot of reasons why you could say, because it was hardly ever a man that was tried for witchcraft. It was almost always women. And
Yeah, but I slightly disagree with Andrew on that because the Netherlands didn't have the same relationship with women that puritanical. I mean, until a bit later. So women had a bit more freedom in the Netherlands, and yet they were still witches. They were still, and I think it was more to. I think it's more to do with weakness. I think it's more to do with fear. I think we create superstitions. We believe in demons. We create witches because there's something in the book about it where effectively, if you've had a bad harvest, they were so afraid, and the world was so unknown, and they couldn't control anything. So if they had a bad harvest, they would die. So they needed something to pray to, and they needed something to blame. They needed some way of protecting themselves because that harvest was everything. That clean water was everything. Those brigands coming over the hill, they would rape and kill. So you needed something. You needed something to believe in or something to blame. And I think if you had a crooked old lady in the village, she was going to be. It is always befalls the weak and helpless, doesn't it? Like it's always the weakest members of society who are the ones who end up on the bonfire. It was never, if a king gets toppled, it's because he's either betrayed or because the entire society revolts against him. I don't think it is. I think the Puritanism that came in later. I think it became a thing. But where I'm set in my book, this sort of earlier stage, I simply think it's a facet of our broken psychology. I think as people, we are hardwired to think in certain ways about things. We're hardwired to believe in certain things because that has helped us survive over the years. And I think those beliefs are still in us, but I think they create sort of psychological weakness. They create an ability to believe in impossible things because we've always needed to believe in impossible things, and now it's becoming a problem. And it was a problem in 1634, and it led to a lot of innocent people being killed, but principally people who needed to be protected.
well, I don't like to go into political, and I won't, other than to say that I think there's a real parallel here with the QAnon, excuse me, going around and easily disseminated through the internet in a way that books did before. Witches had grimoires, and you've talked about your demonological. That was a way that knowledge was shared through not just conversation, but through the printed word, and now we speed it around on the internet. But there are a lot of parallels between what you're writing about and where we are, unquestionably.
And I agree, and I think a lot of it, I mean, again, not to get too deep into politics or any particular politics, but I think if you look at the world and look at the uncertainty around us, like, it's again, you go back to the massive financial crash 2008, there's a lot of jobs were lost, a lot of industries were shuttered, like a lot of people found their lives, UK, US, around the world, they're put into a perilous situation. We've all been put into a place where we're more afraid than we've ever been. Like, there's no surprise that our golden ages tend to correlate with economic certainty and economic strength for everybody across the board, not just the 1%, not the 5%. So I do think that's what's happened. I do think there's a fracture in our society because there's a peril around us. We're worried about things. We're worried about feeding our families at the moment. We're worried about healthcare. We're worried about being able to look after ourselves. Very basic human things. And we've started looking, as people in 1634 did, as people in the 80s, people have done. We're looking for explanations. And that bit of our brain that allows us to do that has resurfaced. It's allowing us to look for what seems to be irrational explanations. But it's easy to say that if you can feed yourself and not worry about your children. So
you've written 2 books now, which are set in very different time periods. And now you're challenging yourself with a 3rd, which you can share with us or not. But I would ask you if you think that the years that you have spent as a journalist have helped you in the sense that, you've honed some writer skills, you've taken stories, researched them, taken them to the end. There never seems to be a clear path to how people become an author. I mean, I've talked to thousands of authors by now, and everybody's story is different. Everybody's story is unique to them, even if there are some commonalities. But I have found that people who are used to writing, to structuring stories, like reporters or lawyers, as a matter of fact,
yeah,
seldom have this sort of writer's block or other kinds kinds of problems that people who come to it in different ways do. So do you think, were you a writer, a journalist in preparation to be a writer? Or was it just a natural outgrowth that, you like telling stories and then it was better to tell your own?
No, I was a journalist in preparation for being an author, so I've wanted to be an author since I was 8 years old.
Ah,
Um, Reading Agatha Christie novels, I wanted to write a book that was just like she. I had no aspiration to write anything that wasn't an Agatha Christie novel, and no aspiration to write anything beyond that. When I was 8, 12, 15, I actually tried to write a book when I was 21, and it was terrible. And that was the thing that I was genuinely awful, but I was really, really terrible. And that was the thing that made me go, because I actually I trained as a lawyer. Basically, I went to university and studied law, and that was the idea of what I was going to do, and then write back books in the background. And when I tried to write that book, I realised how far I was from my goal, like how far I was from being anywhere near a published author, let alone a person who could write a book. So I went into journalism to teach myself these skills, to teach myself how to write and to structure, as you say, to pace is another thing, and how to do all these things. I just loved that job so much, though. Like, I got completely distracted. So initially it was a means to an end, and eventually it became the end in itself, because I was having so much fun being a journalist. It suits everything that I am as a person. I like chatting to people. I like finding out things from people. I like just getting into information, researching topics, and writing that stuff down, and just abstracting yourself from a story and putting somebody else's story on page on their behalf. I adored that. And I still do, actually. It's something I massively miss. So when I wrote my first book, I didn't get a chance to do a lot of research. I went to country houses and I sort of plotted around, but I knew Agatha Christie stories in and out, and I was writing an Agatha Christie story, so I didn't have to do too much research historically and in the period, because that wasn't the point of this book. Whereas this one, I threw myself into the historical research because it was a chance to do both jobs simultaneously. So the ship that this is based on, the Batavia, similar to the one we mentioned, they've rebuilt it in Amsterdam and Lelystad, just outside, and you can go and walk around it. So I did that for 2 days, and I pestered everyone on that ship. Must have been sick of me, because I pestered them for 2 days with seafaring questions and chat about life on board. And the sense of claustrophobia that's in the book comes from that. It's me just crouched down, because I'm 6'2", crouched down in this boat trying to get around and work my way around. So it was just glorious. But the thing about being a journalist that I found most helpful was being edited, because that's the thing I've been talking to authors and a lot of my friends. It was interesting what you said about the writer's block. That is very true. Like, I've never known anyone who's had a deadline and been paid money to write things who's ever had writer's block. We can't afford it, so we don't have it now. But it is noticeable that the other thing that writers struggle with, if they're not trained in one of these arts, is being edited, because it's a personal thing to them. They're writing their own heart, they're putting it on the page, and it's so meaningful, and they spent so much time on it. I spent 20 years with editors just telling me everything I wrote was rubbish. Like, I just had them redlining through it, and you don't get to be, there's no sensitivity about writing left to me anymore. There's just, I think of editing as just a plus. It's a positive in everything you do. A second set of eyes, a third set of eyes, a fourth set of eyes if you're lucky enough. It's the best thing that can ever happen to your work. So that's the thing I've got out of it, and that's the thing I'm glad of.
Wow. Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and thank you very much for elucidating so much of that. It roils around in my mind, because I've been an editor for a long time, and it's difficult if you have an author who takes it in hostile fashion rather than a constructive fashion, because the entire point is to try to make the book clearer and make the story better, and it isn't a contest or a test of wills, if you will, but rather you want the thing to be as clear and as much the story that the author really intends to tell, but occasionally falters in the process. Is
Of course.
What you want.
You can't have that eyes on yourself as you write. Even through journalism, right? It's very different skill set writing a novel and writing a piece of journalism. In journalism, the longest feature I ever wrote was 3,000 words. My first novel was 130,000 words. Holding your concentration for that length, you can do it as a journalist. You can 3,000 words. You can monitor yourself. You can monitor your arc. After a lot of practice, you can understand how to pace your piece, where the quotes need to go. You get a feel for it, a natural feel. It's impossible to do that, however much with how many training, how many books. You can't do that over 130,000 words. You can't, you literally, you have to build that, to build that cabin, you've got to walk into the woods and you start cutting down trees, and you have no idea where you are in the forest. You have no idea what your cabin looks like. It could be halfway up a tree by the time you're done. All you know is that you've got a cabin. So, yeah, it's something I try and tell new writers. It's like, embrace the editing. Like, it's a collaboration, and if you find the only thing I think sometimes is people find the wrong editor for their book, and that sometimes, if the voice of the editor can be a little bit too, they want slightly different things to what the author wants, and I can understand why that relationship can break down. But thankfully, I've not had that. I've had universally great editors.
Which is a real blessing. And I can also tell you from the editorial side, it's a real curse to be stuck with an author whose work doesn't work for you. So, I mean, it can be traumatic on either side. Patrick is over here looking at Facebook. Let me check to see.
Nothing
Just
so
people
far.
are enthralled,
Yeah.
but not asking questions.
Nobody's asking anything yet.
I think you've been so so amazingly articulate that you have.
Oh, sorry.
It's an absolute treat to talk to you. So tell us about what you're working on, just a little bit of a preview, if you will.
My editor would pop up behind me and slit my throat if I
okay.
started talking about book 3. The only thing I can tell you is that it's bonkers. It is nuts, Barbara. It is off the scale crazy. Which, again, I have the same feeling. I'm planning it now. I take 3 months to plan every novel, and I am terrified. I am absolutely terrified of this idea, and that is a brilliant starting point for me. So I think I'm on the right lines. What I don't have yet, I plan my plots. I don't plan my characters. So I find my characters in the writing, and then if the character wouldn't do the thing that I plotted them to do, I have to change the plot around them, which is a bit of a tricky balancing act. So I don't have my characters yet. I have a plot that I think is going to be really interesting, and I think it's going to talk about things that the other 2 books haven't had the chance to talk about. Because I like talking about things in novels that are, a bit beyond the sort of light-hearted fun. I want to be able to chat about things that I think are important. So all those themes are beginning to bubble up in the planning. I've got my conclusion, I've got my beginning, I've got my sort of 3 or 4 massive things I've got to get to in the middle. And now any day now, I'm just going to sit down and sort of like start writing a character and see how they get me there. And that's going to be a delight, I think. Because I think my central character could be wonderful. It could be.
Could be. Well, I'm sure it will be. So if we're not going to talk about your book, tell me, because, I've seen on Instagram posts of your adorable daughter. How does family life blend with the naturally reclusive life of an author?
Oh, I'm not. You may be able to tell I'm not a naturally reclusive man. That's not really. I don't really fit the image of an author very well at all. Like, I like sitting down to a computer for 8 hours is not my preferred way of spending a day. I loved being a journalist because it got me out and talking to all sorts of different people. And where I'm from in the north of England, we are renowned for being chatty, probably too chatty, to be honest. So we'll talk to anybody, which in London, which is a very sort of closed down city, nobody looks anybody in the eye, nobody says good morning, nobody chats. You're a madman in London if you try and sit down on the tube and talk to somebody, and I am that guy. Everyone, oh, hello, where are you going to today? So it's ridiculous. I love my daughter. I love having a daughter because she is that way into everything. She will just run up to everybody and just start chatting to them because she's 2 years of age. She doesn't understand that there's arseholes in the world. She doesn't have that in her. She thinks everyone's delightful because they're always nice to her and try and give her lollipops. So that is wonderful to see. Seeing the world through her eyes is fantastic. The mother-daughter relationship that occurred in this book, in my second book, only happened because my daughter was born. It only happened because I suddenly became interested in the parent dynamic. It's the only reason it's in there. It wouldn't have been in there if she'd not been born. And she was born a month after I started writing the second book, and I finished it 2 days after her second birthday. So she is right across every page of that. She affected absolutely every line of it. So if there's a clumsy line in that book, which hopefully my editor, thank you to my editors UK and US, got rid of, but if one slipped through, it's because I had half an hour's sleep the night before and was trying to write the next day. If there's a particularly golden, brilliant line, or there's some emotion that hits, it's probably because I was having that emotion about her that day. She is woven all the way through it. But then the pandemic hit, as it has everywhere, the childcare here closed, so I had to bring my daughter home and look after her. And for me, writing is an 8 hour a day job, and having to look after because my wife took her for half the day and I took her for the other half. So I was trying to squeeze writing, editing, and the admin, and the emails, and everything that comes with being a relatively successful author. I was trying to squeeze all of that into 3 to 4 hours a day, which is impossible. So, yeah, it's been an interesting experience. It's made me very happy that childcare exists and that there's people who are brilliant at doing the bits of parenting that I am not very good at.
You know, it's a fascinating thing. I had an email the other day from a publicist who said, who knew that working at home was 24/7? And we have this conversation all the time about, you would think in this pandemic when we are, in theory, isolated and slowed down and all, that time would have slowed down, but in fact we feel like we're on some kind of rocket ride. I mean,
Yeah.
I can barely get through. My workday has expanded to, from 14 hours to 16 or 17. It's just endless. Things that used to be possible to do with 1 or 2 contacts now can take like 30, to work out. So we've been astounded. Patrick, if not, I'm going to wind up with a commercial.
No, I mean, the question that just came in is how do you structure your day when you're in writing mode? And he just kind of addressed that.
Right. The question, if you didn't hear it, was how do you structure your day when you're in writing mode? But you've already answered it. So let me conclude by saying that this lovely book, The Devil in the Dark Water, we do have signed book plates for Stuart and some very nice giveaway bags. For those of you who are real purists and want a truly autographed book, we've arranged to acquire a few from London, which are theoretically going to transport themselves over here, not on a ship, but on an airplane. So I haven't put them up on our website yet, but you can order one. And if not, please do think about buying one of the wonderful books with the book plate and the tote bag. Stuart, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I loved your event last year. This is our second event together, and I challenged myself a year ago, July, by pairing Stuart up in a very unlikely way with one of my favorite authors, Linda Castillo. So we had a woman who writes Amish police procedurals, quite structured.
I remember it well.
Yep, and Stuart with the 7, and in the United States it's the 7.5 discs of Evelyn Hardcastle. And yet I thought it was a really brilliant afternoon.
Yeah, we had loads of fun. Yeah, she was lovely.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, the two of you together is so interesting that with books so wildly different, we had many things to talk about that were not different. The perspectives were different, but an enormous commonality. And I think that's one of the great things about the crime writers community, and that you have probably found, is how collegial it is.
Yeah, well, it's like somebody told me, and I don't know how true it is, that crime writing, the audience for crime writing is wonderful because crime readers read voraciously and they will buy a crime book and then immediately go out and buy another crime book. So crime writers aren't really in competition with each other because there's likelihood that if they like you, they'll buy your book as well as the other 10 books on sale that month. So you don't really have too much of a problem. Where something like literary fiction will take someone 6 months to get through. So if they don't buy your book, it's very likely they're not going to buy someone else. And then, so it gets a bit cutthroat. Yeah, it's lovely being a crime writer because also they are the best drinkers, which is slightly off topic, but they truly are. Like every crime festival I go to, everyone is very, very drunk very, very quickly and then very, very honest. And that is entirely wonderful to have when you... It's the thing I miss at the moment with the pandemic. I miss getting out and seeing people and missing my colleagues and actually just being in your beautiful bookstore and sitting down and chatting to people and having a crowd in front of you. And it's a really lovely part of my job. And yeah, it's not the same sat at home on a computer, as lovely as this has been.
Well, but we're fortunate that we have this tool, and we're fortunate it was developed in time. And I think, Stuart, that in the way forward, at least for us, because we've been doing virtual events since 1995, as we happen to find some of our earlier videotapes, is that we should do virtual events where it would be difficult to bring an author here, and then we should do live events where it's possible. But we can also bring together people from diverse locations that would be very difficult logistically to combine, but can lead to great conversations. So, you know, I think it will be a combination, at least for us, in the future, of talks like this and then actual talks with actual customers and folks, not avatars back in the store. And I thought about, you know, setting up chairs like they're doing at sporting events, you know, and then you have a few and I thought, no, you know, it needs to be real or forget.
I did an event yesterday, actually, a big Letteria festival here at Cheltenham, and they're doing a hybrid thing where they had 35 people in the room, but then the rest of it was streamed, and they had like 200 people streaming it at home, and that was an interesting experiment because you did get some of that, but everyone's still quite afraid. I think everybody's still a little bit nervous about being in the room, even though they were socially distanced, had the masks on and things. So it's interesting seeing this path going forward and how we're going to navigate all this stuff.
Well, it really is, and it does allow people who, for reasons of economics or health or geography or whatever it is, cannot attend something live or meet an author that they particularly like, you know, live. And so I think it is a more egalitarian sort of thing, if we can figure out how to manage it. Thank you for your time. It's just a joy to talk to you. I always enjoy it. So I'm looking forward already to doing it again with book 3.
Just give me another 5 years to write it.
All right, we will do that. So thank you, Stuart, and I want to thank all of you who have spent an hour with us this afternoon. Many thanks. Bye.